What's up? Hey, hello, everyone. Wow. So today we are back on the off season of Survivor, going to be talking about Survivor in some topic that came up in the Survivor 40 finale. So my name is Rachel.
And I'm Alyssa, and if you couldn't tell by the title of this podcast, the topic we're going to be discussing is gender bias in Survivor. So, Sarah brought this up in the final tribal council. We've actually spoken on this subject. We did a video on it in February of 2016, and we hadn't graduated high school yet at that point. But as of today, Rachel and I are both college graduates, and so we wanted to return to this subject now that they've talked about it a little in the show, and now that we have more data and more experience in the subject, so yeah, we're super excited to be revisiting it.
Yeah, which is super wild. We'll have the original video linked in the description down below after this airs live. So 4 years really flies by going through our entire college experience, but we are doing a part 2 to our part 1, which is super exciting. And just a disclaimer, obviously, Alyssa and I are going to be talking about gender bias in this video. It might be controversial to some people, but we are basically going to be going over facts from Survivor, so statistics about different things like immunity idols, the fire making challenge, the final 3 versus the final 2, final tribal council, and basically be breaking down how certain elements of Survivor as a game may lead to discriminatory things towards women in the show and how we don't have many female winners anymore for Survivor.
Yeah, so obviously the most obvious stat in this case is that the past 6 winners have all been male winners. So we haven't had a female winner since Sarah in Game Changers. And yeah, that's been a long time. Rachel and I were talking before we started this podcast how in the entirety of our college career, there was only one female winner of Survivor, and that was Sarah. So it's a really long time for there to be no winner. And if you think about it or no female winner, I mean, and if you think about it just in terms of like probability, if you assume that men and women are equally capable Survivor players, the fact that there have been 6 men in a row who won is just like mind boggling.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people who are against the whole notion of gender bias in Survivor often cite that, oh, men and women are born equal, they can do whatever the other gender can do, that kind of argument. But in this video, basically, we're going to be arguing that, sure, people can go into Survivor as equals, but certain aspects of the game definitely make it unequal for men and women to have successful outcomes. So that is what we're going to be focused on. We won't really be focused on like the aspects of what you're bringing into the game, because obviously like your race, your religion, your gender, your nationality, your income all probably affect how you're perceived in the game. So we're not really going to be talking about that.
Yeah, just because there's a lot of factors and we don't know how to weigh all of those factors because they can be different from person to person and season to season. And so part of the
Yeah.
reason Rachel and I wanted to talk about this, like we said, was the fact that it was brought up at Final Tribal, or not Final Tribal, at Final 4, Final 5. It was brought up in the finale episode of this past season, Winners at War. And so Jeff Probst talked about it, Sarah talked about it. Rachel, what did you think about that?
Yeah, so this really inspired Alyssa and I to want to do a video on this during the off season because we saw Jeff bringing it up and we remembered, oh yeah, we did a video on that in the past, so this would be something to be interesting to delve into. And so Jeff bringing it up at Tribal Council, it was like, yeah, great. You know, this is a topic that we all should be talking about, but on the other hand, it did feel a little bit like Jeff was just bringing it up or just including it in the episode just to include it in the episode. From Sarah's point of view, she brought it up because seemingly Boston Rob was smack talking her and shit talking her basically on the edge of extinction the entire time, just because Sarah and Sophie voted Rob out. And so that was the catalyst for Sarah bringing it up at the tribal council. But it just felt sort of like Jeff was just commenting on it and giving Sarah the time of day just to have this in the episode, when Jeff didn't really like say anything or do anything that warrants any change.
Yeah, and I feel like Survivor kind of has a pattern of doing this, because in Island of the Idols, we saw a conversation between Rob and Sandra where they were talking about the winner of the season, and Sandra was like, I bet you it'll be a woman. And Rob was like, I'm not taking that bet. I'm not stupid. And then a man won the season. And I feel like this topic has been repeatedly brought up. Like Angelina brought up in her season how like women are a lot less likely to find idols, and it kind of just never went anywhere. And so the fact that Jeff chose now to bring it up just seems really strange, when like the topic has been broached before, and just we've never been shown conversation about it. We've just been shown like, oh, this person thinks this thing. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's just sort of crappy that like it's been brought up, but nothing is ever done to change it. And then you can bring up the question like, oh, how can we make this game more equitable for people of different genders? So, like, that is sort of what we're going to be bringing up in this podcast, because Alyssa and I have statistics basically about how certain aspects of the game make it unequal. But it's just sort of crappy that, like, the host we'll just say it and not actually make changes or continue to implement things that make it unfair for people of different genders to be successful at the game. Because even us as young 22-year-olds, Alyssa, it's just sort of discouraging that like if we applied to this show, we're probably going to be voted out early, probably be one of the first boots, and like that's crappy that the odds to win the game are stacked against you even before you literally step foot on the island. And I think it's like a rumor or sort of fact that Jeff Probst doesn't like female winners. And so I distinctly remember like people on Reddit before Co Wrong, which was season 32, happened, that people were saying, oh, a female is going to win this season because Jeff isn't so hype about the season, so probably a girl is going to win. And it turned out right that like Michelle won, and it's supposedly that Michelle is one of Jeff's least favorite winners. So it's just sort of crappy that that's a rumor, or if that's actually real, that he dislikes female winner seasons.
Yeah, and I feel like Jeff also, when handling this question, just like did not do a very good job, because he then goes and asks the men their opinion about it. And it's kind of like Sarah gives this thing like it feels like it's hard to be a female playing this game. And instead of Jeff being like, oh, Denise, what do you think about this? He's like, Tony, tell me whether or not you're a sexist. And I just feel like that's so like patronizing, I guess. So, yeah, it was frustrating to see this exchange just because it felt very much like lip service.
Yeah, and it's really interesting, even in Island of the Idols, also, that in one of the tribal councils, Jamal brought up that the female alliances, and then how, like, oh, women alliances are always super scary, and all women's alliance. And maybe that has its origins back to Parvati and the Black Widow Brigade, and now for some reason everyone is afraid of women alliances, but no one is ever afraid of like when 3 or 4 men get together and want to form an alliance. Even this season with the lions versus hyenas strategy, we see Tony say that, oh, the lions include Tony, Ben, Jeremy, and Tyson. But even in that podcast, Alyssa and I were like, where's Kim? Kim should obviously be included in the lions group if you're doing the straight lions versus hyenas and not thinking of tribal lions or anything like that. So it's just interesting how male alliances aren't shat on, but female alliances are oftentimes like put to the forefront or pushed as an agenda. Like, oh, those are 4 girls getting together. That's super scary, even if they aren't in an alliance together. But like 4 men can get together as the big dog alliance, and then no one will target them as a big dog or male alliance.
Yeah, and I just think also we see that with like the three amigos in Philippines. Just like they're just bros being bros. It's not a scary thing for them to be together. So I just like I think Island of the Idols, I feel like was Survivor's best attempt at talking about issues, but it also failed in so many ways because I think the conversation between Jack and Jamal about like race issues was really eloquent, but then the discussion with like about gender wasn't as nuanced. I don't think they still had Jamal be a spokesperson for that, which I think is again like having men speak about women's issues. Obviously women need male allies and like male voices should be a part of the conversation, but they shouldn't be the ones like dominating the conversation. And we also had like the whole situation with Dan, I feel like undoes everything Survivor can say about like, oh, we care about people equally. Because again, it was just a pattern of a woman saying something and not being believed, even though there were literal tapes of it happening. So, yeah.
Yeah, so starting to go into a little more of our statistics. One of the things that Alyssa and I found super interesting was that the first boot is 70% of the time a woman. And I think that's really fascinating because the first boot is usually based off of the first 3 days on the beach. So maybe it's based off of preconceived notions, implicit bias, stuff like that. So it's like, oh, if you're 70% of the time wanting or you're voting out a woman first, does that say something about the people on the tribe? Like, oh, is the woman weaker because they're smaller, they can't compete in challenges, they talk too much, so they're annoying, let's vote them out. So I think it brings up a larger conversation about maybe implicit bias and what the preconceived notions are for stepping foot on the beach, that is the case. And I think it's really interesting, even like I think millennials versus Gen X is a super good example of females being voted out early in the game. And if you look at like the first 7 boots of millennials versus Gen X, it's literally all of the minority women and then the older male on the Gen X tribe. So it's like, okay, you are like literally just voting out people who are not in the in group, which is people who maybe look the same as you, who have similar jobs as you, who have kids or whatever. So it's like really, really fascinating that the people who don't look the same as you are being voted out first.
Yeah, and I think it's especially, I guess, problematic that women might be the first boot because, oh, they're weaker. Because a lot of times it's like puzzles and stuff. Like most of the challenges Survivor does aren't just physical challenges because I think they at least endeavor to make it more equal for people, or if there is a physical element to the challenge, there's also an equalizing force like that weird snake puzzle that isn't just brute strength and speed. And so I feel like excluding women because they're weaker or don't perform as well in challenges is just like straight bias and isn't necessarily in line with how people actually perform in challenges. Because then you also see, like, if a man performs poorly in challenges, there's a lot of times an excuse like, oh, we can keep him around as a goat, or like, oh, we need him for his vote. And I feel like women aren't given that same consideration. And I guess I don't have numerical proof of that, but it feels like a pattern when I watch the TV.
And maybe it can bring up the larger conversation that the challenges make it so that females are voted out earlier because the challenges are maybe more geared to, oh, the gym rat who works out every single day and not maybe the single parent, single mother, single father who can't go to the gym every day because they are literally working all the time. So I think I don't know. That's a really interesting conversation because it's like, I feel like it seems that the men are often put on a pedestal for being super buff or working out a ton. So, oh yeah, you can carry our tribe. And then it becomes a detriment for the men come the individual portion of the game. Once tribal stuff ends and you're doing individual immunities, then it's like, oh yeah, you don't want to be a big dude because then you're going to get voted out. But I don't know. It's like maybe something needs to change at the beginning challenges, because I feel like once you start going into individual immunities, maybe you can argue that men and women are more on an equal scale, because then you're only playing for yourself and you're not going to vote out someone because, oh, they're weaker. You're going to vote out the people who are stronger at the challenges. And so I don't know, like, how can you fix that? And it's interesting that females are often saved because they're good at puzzles, but you never really hear, oh, this woman is super good at the physical portion of the challenge, maybe swimming, something like that. Like weight and like carrying stuff, you're not going to be like, oh yeah, let's keep her because she can carry 50, 60 pounds. It's just sort of unrealistic because of like body type and stuff like that, which I don't know. It's really fascinating.
I think it's especially funny when people say that, like, oh, women are voted out early because they're not like physically strong, when a literal Olympic swimmer was the first person voted out of her season. Like, how can you argue that she is like not physically comparable with like the average dude?
Yeah, and I like that definitely just goes to show there's so many different biases that people have, different discriminations, because it's like she was probably, it seemed like, voted out because she was an older woman, and Chrissy wasn't voted out. And so I don't know, like, she's an older woman, she's a mom, and you can definitely say that like age plays a huge factor into bias in Survivor as well. So it's not just like gender that is causing issues, but I don't know. It's really fascinating because it definitely is a microcosm of the world, as they like to say. That's why Survivor is so interesting, because it does portray real life and it does have a lot of real life biases. But just the fact that like people of color and women are discriminated seemingly against more, it's something that is a fatal flaw of the game.
Yeah, and I feel like one piece of evidence that kind of substantiates our like physical challenges are geared towards men thing is Edge of Extinction returnees. There's only been 4 of them, so it's admittedly not that large of a data pool, but like 3 of them were men: Rick Devens, Chris Underwood, Tyson, and then the one woman was Natalie. And you could argue that Wendell would have beat Natalie if Natalie hadn't had those 3 advantages. Like, it was a pretty close game. And I believe Wendell only had 1 advantage. So if there had been no advantages in that return challenge, then Wendell probably would have won.
Yeah, so going into some more statistics, we are going to talk a little bit about women at the final tribal council, and then also women at final tribal council getting 0 votes at final tribal council, and sort of how the final 3 versus the final 2 changes the aspects of the game, and the fire making challenge, how that changes the result of the game. And so with the final 3. So, women at Final Tribal Council this season was actually the first Final 3 to have 2 women in it since Ko-Rong. So, a long time, basically. And Natalie was the first woman to get a vote at Final Tribal Council since Chrissy in season 35. So, that's been, what, 5 seasons where a woman who, there are women in Final Tribal Council in all of these seasons, but they've all gotten 0 votes in them. And so I think that's really, really fascinating. So out of the 14 times a woman has sat in the final 3 with 2 men, about 67% of the time a woman receives 0 jury votes, and they only win about 21% of the time. So that is really drastically geared towards, if you're sitting 1 woman, 2 men, final 3, you are probably going to lose with a 2/3 chance of the time. Like, that's just sort of sad to see on paper that your odds are greatly stacked against you just by doing that. So In season 35, so we're starting season 35 since Sarah won season 34, but 35 had Ben, Chrissy, and Ryan in it. Season 36, you have Wendell, Dom, and Laurel in it. Season 37, you have Nick, Mike, and Angelina, with Angelina getting 0 votes. Laurel also getting 0 votes. Season 38, you have Chris, Gavin, and Julie, with Julie getting 0 votes. 39, Tommy, Dean, and Nora, with Nora not getting any votes. And then season 40 obviously happened last week. We have Tony, Natalie, and Michelle, where Natalie gets 4 votes, Michelle gets 0 votes. So I think this is really fascinating because in the final threes with like Angelina, Julie, and Nora, I distinctly remember like these seasons after they got 0 votes or even after they made final 3, everyone was discounting them like, oh yeah, you know, these 3 women, like Julie cried all the time, Nora was crazy, and like Angelina was also crazy and didn't talk too much. It's all sort of female stereotypes like, oh, they cry too much like Julie, so they're emotional, or they're a bad player because they're using their emotions. And so I don't know, I just find it really fascinating that like you can make the final 3 and like you can definitely argue that the women in the final 3 did play good games, and it could just be like editing that made them look the way that they did. So obviously they're not going to get any votes at final tribal council, but like you can also argue like listening to Nora's end of season stuff after Island of the Idols, like she knew what she was doing, and honestly she seemed to have a really cool game that just wasn't shown on television.
Yeah, and I feel like you can also talk about like what game is respected versus not respected in the Survivor community. And so it's like we've seemed to enter this era of like big moves. You have to like play a lot of idols, you have to do a lot of flashy things, you have to win fire or whatever in order to be respected as like a good winner. And so it's like that's not the only good kind of Survivor game. And I feel like one of the reasons why old Survivor, like the first 25 seasons, was a lot more egalitarian was because there were several different kinds of games that were represented, and you could win pretty much equally playing any of those games as long as you weren't like a total dick and bad at jury management. And I feel like that isn't really reflected in new school Survivor. Like
Mm-hmm.
basically since Tony's win in Cagayan, the whole thing has been like make big moves, do all these crazy things. And so that I think is where more of our statistics like come into play because a lot of the things that we consider big moves are things that women are barred from doing or there's obstacles to them doing it for whatever reason.
And I think Sarah mentioned it at tribal council, like even the perceptions of, oh, a woman lies, backstabs, oh yeah, they're the B word. But if a man blindsides and backstabs, oh yeah, that's great. That's like Tony. That's a big move gameplay kind of thing. And I think that's really interesting if you juxtapose the two of those. And even when Chrissy was in Final Tribal Council as a supposed villain, people were like, oh, you're the mom. You're not allowed to lie. You're not allowed to backstab. So it's really fascinating just because of someone's status as a mother or whatever that, oh yeah, you can't backstab because you're a mom, and moms are supposed to be like nice and friendly and stuff, but like Ben is a father and he's allowed to do those things. So it's really really fascinating, and I think you can also bring to the point that like a lot of the respected or the Mount Rushmore Survivor players, a lot of people want to play like Parvati. And what is Parvati known for? And she's seemingly only known for is like, oh, being flirty. But you can also say that, you know, Parvati played a bomb ass game in the times that she's played. And it wasn't just based on flirtations, but she also made moves and blindsided. But people tend to focus on, yeah, she's so good because she's flirty. And other women, if they are trying to be flirtatious too on the camp, like, yeah, we need to vote them out because that's dangerous. But I don't know.
I think it's also interesting because even the women who aren't mothers, like I don't think Angelina is a mom. Yeah, but like she was painted as like a bitch for like having a stronger personality and wanting to make big moves, and it's like when a man does that, it is acceptable. And so I guess it's not even just for moms, it's for women of any ages. And it's like you can say what you want about Debbie being crazy. Like I think we poked fun at her like several times, but it's kind of the same thing where even an older woman like has an entirely different set of expectations where like everyone thought that Philip Shepherd was like the coolest person ever or at least like a funny character, and I feel like Debbie gets more hate than he did even though they're basically the same person. So it's like one of those things where it seems like women, like there's no right way to be a woman survivor player unless you're like a man's right hand person or something like that.
Yeah, so another statistic that we have is that a woman has never received a unanimous jury vote or played the perfect game, versus 5 men have received unanimous jury votes, and then two of them have played perfect games in Cochrane and JT, I think. The only woman to come close to a unanimous vote is Sandra in her first season. And so I don't know. Maybe, if you're on Survivor and you're a female, the way to win, you got to go final three, all women, or final two, all women, because otherwise, 67% of the time, you are going to not win. So I think that is really fascinating. And I think Alyssa and I's argument for Survivor being an inherently flawed game comes into play when we are going to talk about the pre-advantage era of Survivor, so old school Survivor, and then the post-advantage era of Survivor. So we're splitting this at season 28 because a lot of people, it seems like on Reddit and stuff, say that Tony's season is where Survivor changed to be the big moves era of Survivor. So pre-advantage Survivor big moves era, which would be season 1 through 27, we had a very equitable female to male win ratio in 12 women winning and then 15 men winning. But then after Tony Kagayan's season, it seems like we have a very drastic switch. So from 28 to 40, so 13 seasons, we only have 3 female winners in Natalie, Michelle, and Sarah, but 10 male winners in Tony, Mike, Jeremy, Adam, Ben, Wendell, Nick, Chris, and Tony. And so, like Alyssa mentioned at the beginning, it is so freaking wild that we can go from season 35 to 40, have 6 male winners in a row, which is the longest male winner streak ever, after there was a 4-season running of male winners back in the day. Yes, I can find it, but we've never had like a male winning streak this long, and it's just really, really interesting that it seems like the game mechanics after Big Moves era, it seems to favor a certain kind of player more than another.
Yeah, and I think a really big part of that is finding idols. And so I mentioned before that Angelina like mentioned how women find idols a lot less often than men. And in the first 37 seasons of Survivor, 17 idols or 17 idols were found by women, but there were 98 idols total found. So basically, 17% of the idols were found by women. And so that's actually become a lot more equitable because in the past 3 seasons, so 38, 39, 40, women found 16 idols. And so it's also worth noting that a lot of these idols were found either by returning players, or like most of them were found by returning players actually, because Aubrey and Kelly each found one on their season, and then Kim, Sophie, and
Denise.
Denise all found idols this season. And also, just a side note, we decided to discount any idols that were found on Edge of Extinction, purchased with the Edge of Extinction menu, or given at Island of the Idols in that season, just because those were all crazy and like people couldn't always control going to Island of the Idols. So we didn't want to include those because we felt like that would skew the numbers. And so in total, we have 121 idols found across the whole 40 seasons of Survivor, and 33 of them were found by women. That means that roughly a quarter of all of the idols were found by women across the entire history of Survivor, which is like really questionable. And so this was actually something that was touched on. Vince in season 38, I believe was his season, he talked about how one of the reasons that might happen is because a lot of times women are expected to stay at the camp and like do the cooking or cleaning or whatever, and then men are allowed to like go out and gather firewood or whatever. And so he was like, we're not doing that. Like the women can go out and get firewood if they want, because getting firewood is like a common euphemism for going out to find idols, I feel like. And so if the women are always expected to be the ones like sitting at camp doing the activities that keep them at camp, how are they ever going to like find an idol?
And yeah, it's really fascinating that these gender norms from everyday life seep their way into the Survivor game, because you can argue that, like, okay, yeah, a woman's role is to be creating the home, and that seems like a very old-fashioned way of thinking, like, oh yeah, the female should clean, cook, take care of the family, but like that's how it literally was back in the day. And so I think it's really, really interesting how that can seep into Survivor, like, oh yeah, the women should be making the rice, or what, knitting the palm fronds. So like, oh
Weaving
yeah,
the palm fronds, yeah.
they're stuck at camp all day, versus the men are going out to get the wood to create the shelter. And I don't know, like, how can you fix that in the game? Because it's not necessarily anyone's fault that, like, yeah, you know, the women are out here weaving the palm fronds and they're not going to go and get the idol. So I guess, I don't know, like, it's not really Survivor's fault. It sort of seems like that the bias that the players are bringing in are maybe creating this discrepancy. And so how do you fix that? Do you go into a Survivor season and try to create new norms, like, oh yeah, us girls, we can go carry logs too. We're going to go out and get logs and like look for idols while you're at it. And it's not going to be a sketchy thing. But if you're the first person to do that, you're probably going to have a target on your back, because it's not normal for the women to go out and collect that stuff on the first day, when you should be, oh yeah, getting water, getting rice ready, weaving palm fronds, stuff like that. So it's sort of like, how can you fix something like that if it seems like that the players are bringing in these biases into the game, and that leads to women not finding idols as much, which then has the ripple effect of that they can't save themselves when they might need saving, which then has the effect of not making it even to final tribal council, because they're all getting voted out because they're already going to be the first boot. And then without this extra protection of safety, I don't really know how you can fix this.
And it's also like, it's not just they need the idols for themselves, but it's like playing an idol for someone else successfully is a really big move that you can bring to the jury as a part of your resume. Or like if you have the immunity necklace, but one of your alliance members is on the chopping block and you want to keep them around so that your alliance can remain in the majority, like that's a big thing too. And I feel like that's one of the things that is difficult, like you say, because it's people with the biases already brought into it. But I feel like a lot of times people aren't thinking like, oh, I'm going to sit and weave the palm fronds, which means I won't be able to go out and find an idol. Like, I think a lot of people are just happy to like look like they're contributing to the camp because those first days are really crucial in relationship building. And so I feel like no one is thinking about it except for in hindsight, and then in hindsight it becomes super obvious.
Yeah, and I think you can definitely say the opposite plays into effect as well. Like Stephen Fishback helping the women weave the palm fronds in Second Chance. Like, oh yeah, you're all looking at him like he's so weak, he can't even cut the tree that he was trying to cut. But Savage can literally chop down a freaking tree, and like the macho men can get together and then they all go out searching. But like Stephen Fishback goes out searching, and oh, suddenly he's like neurotic and he's a huge threat. Similarly, like, I don't know, like it sort of works both ways for this one, that like there's so much bias just within the system that like if you don't do something within the norm of Survivor or norm of gender roles, like men should be able to chop the wood and then females should be able to weave the palm fronds. Then like if you go out of that way, then it's like, oh, something's wrong with this person. And then like they get a target on their back, which is like, what the heck?
Yeah, and I feel like it's just one of those things where hopefully as society changes, the game will also change. But also, I feel like there has to be something that people can do to expedite that process. Because changing 20 people's minds, I feel like is easier than changing like the entirety of America's minds. And I also feel like one of the things we saw about Survivor is because these people are together so often, they can have like really deep conversations about hard subjects. And so, yeah.
Yeah, so definitely let us know in the comments what you think of immunity idols and the gender bias that surrounds them. Like, how would you go about fixing the lack of women who find immunity idols because the gender norms are you should stay at camp and weave the palm frond? So we definitely want to know because I think for us, we're having a difficult time finding a solution to this because it's so entrenched in our society today. And obviously, that's going to be brought into the game. But our next point is on the fire making challenge. And I think with this, like, obviously, for other reasons, you should just get rid of the fire making challenge. But I definitely think that the fire making challenge negatively disadvantage women on the show Survivor. So, ever since the fire making challenge started in season 35, we've seen a lot of women be barred from making it to final tribal council because they lose at the fire making challenge. And so season 35, Devin lost, Ben won. Season 36, Wendell won and Angela lost in fire. Season 37, Kara lost in fire and Mike won. 38, Rick lost and Chris won. 39, Lauren lost in fire and then Dean won. And then season 40, Sarah lost in fire. So it's like, I don't know, a really interesting thing that like the final four, ever since the fire making challenge started, we've been seeing a lot less women in the final tribal council being able to even have their time in front of the jury to even have the chance to win the game. So I don't know. For other reasons too, I think you just have to get rid of the final four fire making challenge.
Yeah, we talked about that before just because Final Four fire means that someone can essentially come back in from edge and then just do a straight shot, or just get to Final Six and do a straight shot. So,
Yeah, and it's not even like deserving women are not playing the game of Survivor because sometimes people are like, yeah, you know, Nora never deserved to win because she's a wacko. But then also you can say in season 39, there's a lot of like deserving people who were just voted out early because of twists in the game. And so after Big Move Survivor, you know, these producers love their twists. So we're having the Idol Nullifier come in at final 6 in Survivor season 39, and then Janet goes, and you could definitely argue like Janet could have easily won the game. Similarly, like Elaine could have easily won the game of Survivor. So it's just a disconnect, it seems, in the final few days of the game where like the twists that are being introduced into the game are barring the deserving people from getting to the end. And I could see that you could argue that, oh yeah, if you're a good Survivor player, you can totally get around all of these twists because the best Survivor players can and they will adapt. But then it's like if you're introducing a goddamn
Idol
nullifier at
Nullifier.
6, yeah, it's like
That is
there's
the
no way.
stupidest thing ever. I've talked before about how much I hate the Idol Nullifier because I feel like the majority of idols are actually not played successfully. And then if you want to, the majority of idols are not played successfully, and then you make it even harder to play one successfully.
What was your question?
There was no question. It was just a mini rant. I hate Idol Nullifiers so much. So
Yeah, it just I don't know. It seems like there are a lot of like twists ever since Tony won Survivor that are being introduced, and I think Jobber Jim brings up a really interesting point in the chat right now that like are idols hidden in a way that women are less likely to find them? And I think yeah, you could argue yes if they are hidden in a tree like super high up and you have to climb for it. Is it more likely that the men are going to be climbing up the tree than the women or like looking up there? I don't know. I think like that's a really, really fascinating point.
I think it's also, I said this in the chat, but I'll say it out loud for the people who aren't reading the chat. Like, what is line of
Mm-hmm.
sight for one person is not going to be in someone else's line of sight. So if it was like designed to be in such a way that people could maybe like catch it out of the corner of their eye, someone who is of similar height to the
Yeah.
person who did the idol hiding is going to have more success. And I feel like that kind of just goes in general with everything. Like if you can get in the brain of whoever is hiding the idols, you're more likely to be successful.
Yeah. So definitely hidden immunity idols are something that I think has added more discrepancy into the game of Survivor. And so it seems like the big move era, ever since Tony won, you have to make these quote unquote big moves in order to win the game. But maybe if you play the more nuanced social game like Michelle was playing, and like, yeah, you create these amazing social relationships that is less well respected. Even though, last season Tommy won and he did that social game, but it seems that like Michelle doing it, yeah, you could say Tony, both Alyssa and I think Tony should have won. But it's just interesting that, like, yeah, Tommy can do it and it's praised. Oh, yeah, he went back to an old school version of the game, but now Michelle is doing it. And then she's getting shat on for, like, only doing a social game and not making any big moves. But Tommy said he was doing a social game. He didn't need the bling bling that Dean had. And then that was well respected over Dean having the bling bling.
Yeah, that just seems like when do you choose to respect the social game and when do you not? And it seems like the answer is just there is no definitive answer, which I don't like.
Yeah, and I think it'll start to be interesting. Alyssa and I weren't going to talk about fire tokens in this podcast because it's only been one season, so it's hard necessarily to find if there has been any patterns or anything happening with the finding of fire tokens, the playing of fire tokens. So I think it will be interesting, maybe in another 4 years, if we do another one of these like we did 4 years ago, if fire tokens have some kind of negative aspect on the game of Survivor, similar to like the fire making challenge or changing the final 2 to final 3. So I don't know. I think that'll just be super fascinating how like we can't really tell, but maybe fire tokens could be an equalizer if they are implemented correctly. And maybe you bring back the auction and having a social game is rewarded because when you're bequeathed fire tokens, you're basically being rewarded for having a social game. Then maybe if you have an auction, people who have good social games can buy more stuff, advantages at an auction or something like that. So it's less so of the let me go find an idol in a tree or let me not weave palm fronds today, but let me go out and have a good social game, and maybe that will make the social game more respected in Survivor because it seems that people focus so much on the like outwit, outlast, outplay, but like where does the social game fall into those three categories?
Yeah, and I feel like this season it's also hard to tell whether or not fire tokens were doing anything because this was also an all-star season. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's like a lot of them, we talked about how there's so many pre-existing relationships coming into this game. So who you bequeath your fire tokens to might not necessarily be who has the best social game. It might just be who's the person that you know from before the game. So I would love for fire tokens to be an equalizer, but like you said, I feel like the whole outwit, outplay, outlast thing really doesn't leave a lot of room for the social game because it's kind of tied in with Outlast, but a lot of people seem to think about that in like a sense of endurance type stuff, I think. So,
Yeah, it just seems that like what women are more stereotypically good at or praised for in a social game, or like, oh, the parvati flirtatious game is not really something that is respected in Survivor. I think it'd be interesting if like a Parvati 2.0 came along and tried to replicate that kind of flirtatious game and made it to the end. I feel like it wouldn't win nowadays, but it would have won in olden days Survivor, because it seems like nowadays, like the relationships that you make aren't as important, but it's more of the, whatever the word is, the tribal lines are not drawn in the sand, but they are always changing, and so it doesn't like really matter. It just matters who you can align with for this vote, and then you can flop on the next vote, and you maybe have a core 2 or 3 group. But having a bunch of friends, like maybe someone like Michelle has, is not as put on the pedestal as like blindsiding everyone at tribal council or putting on a show at tribal council like Rick did.
yeah, and I feel like also people reduce Parvati's game to just the flirtation when it's like the Black Widow Brigade getting that together and getting them to work was a huge social feat, I feel like. And then also getting Eric to give up his immunity necklace was, I think, the single most brilliant social move in the game. And so I feel like that's the kind of thing that we wish would be more respected. Like getting someone to not play an idol is, I feel like, a more impressive feat than yourself playing an idol.
So I don't, it's just such a hard topic to battle. I think Alyssa and I would definitely be interested in what you all think and how can we combat gender bias in Survivor, because it is really sad that, Alyssa and I can go through 4 years of college and then see what, 7 men win and then only 1 woman in Sarah win the game of Survivor. So it's just like, I think for younger people watching, maybe if they're younger fans of the show and maybe they're interested in Survivor, but then it's like, oh, you don't see someone who looks like you on the television, or you don't see that kind of representation. And I think that can go for a lot of things too, like race, gender, religion, sexuality, stuff like that. It's like, I don't know. I think the argument goes for like teachers too. It's like a lot of times teachers aren't the most diverse group of people. So it's like if you don't see someone who looks like you in pop culture, I don't know. I think it just sort of has negative effects.
Yeah, because I feel like it's one of those things where it's a self fulfilling prophecy, where like Survivor Cook Islands failed in a lot of ways, but it was also the singular most diverse cast in Survivor history. So I feel like one of those things where like Survivor producers consciously try to like do better, I feel like is
Mm-hmm.
something that we're kind of missing here. Where like there's not a clear answer, and so I feel like maybe that's why the gender bias in Survivor continues on the way it does. Because
Yeah,
it's like they can't fix it.
and I don't think it's a problem with casting, honestly. Like the past few seasons, we've had a bunch of bomb ass ladies out there. Like, a lot of people are supporting Elaine and Janet and Kelly. Like, so many really interesting, diverse characters that are more, I think, relatable than like your certain model type people or your recruits for the show. But like these people, it's like they are willing to play, they know the game, and they're super fans of the show and they want to go and play the game. And maybe that's the answer. Like if you can cast a season where it's 18 to 20 people only of super fans, then you won't have the recruits who watch like 1 or 2 season who think, oh, the only way to play this game is to vote out the female first. But even like last season, we see they vote Ronnie out first because it's people who know the game. They're willing to challenge the status quo, but maybe it's the fact that the noobs to the game don't know any better. And so when someone just throws out an easy name, like, oh, yeah, they were weak in the challenge, let's go for it, they'll just go for it rather than thinking maybe 2 steps ahead and like, okay, what would be the best move that isn't maybe the norm that everyone goes through in Survivor.
Yeah, so we would love to hear what you guys think about this subject. We'd also like to hear if you guys think there's a way to fix this. Like, how can Survivor do better? And yeah, leave your comments down below. Also, let us know what other videos you'd like to see us make, because, like we said, we're heading into a really long season break just because season 41 hasn't even started filming yet.
Which
So
is interesting though, because Survivor this week just released their like playlist, not the right word, but that for the fall season, the list of shows and the times that they're going to be airing them. So basically the schedule for CBS fall, and they do have Survivor in the 8 to 9 p.m. slot with the Amazing Race season airing directly after. So it is interesting because are they somehow going to film season 41? I think it's still doable if they start maybe by July, and then you can film and edit a season by the time August rolls around. Maybe you push back into September, or maybe they're tricking us all and they're going to play reruns for the fall, and they just stuck it on the schedule to have a rerun or something.
yeah, but so we're always looking to make more Survivor content. We love getting to talk to you guys and read your comments, and we'll see you